This is lecture 3, cell structure and function. And so this lecture comes from Concepts of Biology, chapter 3. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the roles of cells in organisms, name examples of prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, compare and contrast prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells, how are they different, describe the structure of eukaryotic plant and animal cells, and summarize the functions of the major cell organelles. So we've kind of talked about how there is a lot of different forms of life, more than what we kind of just think of as usual. So plants and animals for sure we can think of are alive, but there's other things too. And so that includes like bacteria cells and archaea. So even though we don't hear about archaea as much, there are single-celled organisms that just one cell is one organism. And so we talked about the different characteristics of life. And so one of the characteristics is the organization, and that they're all made of cells. Like that's the smallest unit of life. And so different organisms have very different kinds of cells. So for example, here in a human, the nasal sinus cells are shown in, panel A. In panel B, it's showing onion cells under a microscope. So all these under a microscope. And then panel C is a kind of bacterial cell. So there are very different organisms, but they all have cells. And so, like a brick wall, your body is made of a bunch of different kinds of cells. But like the brick wall, your body is made of basic building blocks, and the building block of your body is cells. So there could be different kinds of cells, but they all have some things in common. So yeah, a cell is the smallest unit of life or of a living thing. Bacteria, like I said, just one cell of a bacteria is an organism, it's alive. And then if you were to break down like us, the smallest unit is a cell. So your cells can be made of many kinds of cells, and they're all specialized. So for example, like nasal cells, skin cells, pancreas cells, nerve cells. There are very, very different, and they're very specialized for a specific thing, but all cells have some things in common. So something that all cells have, no matter what the grouping is, are 4 common things. So a plasma membrane, which is, the cell membrane. And that is an outer covering that separates the cell's interior from its environment. So in this picture to the right, it's shown in like a kind of darker blue line outlining the circle. So that's the cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane. The cytoplasm is a jelly-like region inside the cell. So if you were to think of the cell as like a water balloon, the balloon, the plastic of the balloon is the membrane. And the inside, the water that's kind of like makes up the water balloon, is the cytoplasm. So that's kind of like a rough analogy. Even though in the cell, it's a little bit more thick than just water. It's kind of like jelly-like. And everything else inside the cell kind of just like floats in there. Yeah. So another thing that all cells have in common is DNA. So DNA is the genetic material of the cell, and that's necessary for the cell to have instructions. It's the instruction manual for making things and for doing everything. So everything that needs to be and happen for a cell to live and like do things is held in the instruction manual. That's the DNA. And then lastly, all cells have ribosomes. So these are these little particles that make proteins. So I kind of compare them to like a 3D printer. So ribosomes are the actual printer that like make the thing that you're printing out. And then the DNA is like the instructions or the protocol or whatever you put in that tells it like, okay, make this, print it this shape and, this color and whatever. So the DNA is like the instructions, the protocol, the code, and then the ribosomes are the 3D printer that actually make things necessary for the cell. So those are the 4 things that all cells have in common. And so bacteria have this for sure, and so that's why they are considered cells and alive. And viruses are not cells because they're not made of these things. It doesn't have a plasma membrane. There's no cytoplasm. There is DNA in some viruses. In other viruses, it's RNA. So even though it has that, the fact that it doesn't have these other three things, they don't have ribosomes to make their own proteins. It's really just like a little protein shell, like a Ferrero Rocher chocolate. So again, that's why viruses are not alive, because they are not made of the stuff that cells are made of. So even though we picture them as like a little, circle with like spikies and then some DNA inside, it's not the same as a cell. So they are not alive. And they're actually much, 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 much smaller than cells. I know to us it's kind of like harder to comprehend. Cells themselves are already microscopic. But viruses, you would need like a whole another kind of microscope to view because they're so tiny. So again, that's just another comparison of like what is, something that's living versus something that's not living. So bacteria, even though bacteria do make you sick, bacteria are alive because they are made of cells that have these things. And viruses are not. So there are two main groups of like kinds of cells. So if you were to discover a cell, you'd have to look under the microscope to look at an individual cell and see, okay, is this prokaryotic or eukaryotic? So yeah, these are just two kind of big groupings of cells, and then from there we could figure out what further groupings things can, fall under. So prokaryotes, or prokaryotic cells, one individual, like bacteria, is one organism. So one cell is one organism. So that's what it means by unicellular. Prokaryotes, like just one cell, is one organism. These cells are typically smaller under the microscope if you were to compare the two cells side by side. Prokaryotic cells are just a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells. Again, it's kind of hard to see like just in your mind, but under the microscope it still makes a huge difference. Like even though they're both microscopic, bacteria are much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells. Another big thing that differentiates them is that prokaryotic cells don't have membrane-bound organelles like a nucleus. So there are other, organelles, and we'll talk more about the different kinds of organelles, but especially the nucleus, prokaryotes don't have that. They just have their DNA kind of free-floating. So prokaryotes only include individuals in the domain bacteria and domain archaea. So I showed that picture in the first lecture of the three big domains. So there's domain bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. So domains bacteria and archaea fall under prokaryotic cells because they match all these things. They're single-celled organisms, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. That's like the big thing that differentiates them. Versus eukaryotic cells, eukaryotes, they're usually multicellular, so one organism is made of a lot of cells. There are some that are pretty simple and can be single-celled, but they have these other qualifications that make them eukaryotic cells and not prokaryotic cells. So usually these organisms are multicellular, so that's a big hint that something is eukaryotic. Another thing is that, the cells are usually bigger, they're more complex, and they do have organelles. So they do have all the organelles that we're going to talk about later on. So like the nucleus, the mitochondria, a bunch of different things. Eukaryotes do have that. And that includes domain eukarya. And so even though that's just one of the three domains, that domain is huge. So there's a lot of different things that fall under that. And that usually will contain things that we think of as alive, plants and animals and things like that. Those are the big groups. I know at first when you are learning about just these two types of cells, and it's kind of easy to flip the words, like which one is the small one, which one is the more complex one. So try to remember that you are eukaryotes. You carry organelles. And then from that you can know, so prokaryotes are the other ones, the small ones that are less complex and don't have organelles. So You are eukaryotes. Humans, we're multicellular. Our cells do have organelles, and so we are eukaryotes. You are eukaryotes. You carry organelles. So just a little bit more about prokaryotic cells. So mostly we're going to focus on eukaryotic cells, but just to, give a little bit of info on the prokaryotic cells, like I said, it's just bacteria and archaea. A prokaryotic cell is a simple single-celled organism that doesn't have a nucleus or any other membrane-bound organelles. So if you were to look at the DNA is just kind of in like a little middle region called the nucleoid, but that's more of like a region that's not like an actual separate space to house the DNA. So the DNA is found as just kind of the central part of the cell. So if you were to be given like a slide with a bacteria or with a cell and asked like, okay, is this prokaryotic or eukaryotic? The main giveaway would be, is there a nucleus or no? Where's the DNA? Is it just kind of like free floating? Then that's a prokaryotic cell. Versus eukaryotic cells, they do have a membrane-bound nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So what does that even mean, membrane-bound organelles? So, there's the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. That's, a membrane. But you can also have other membranes on the inside that separate different spaces from other parts of the cell. And within that space, because it's separate, that can have its own little environment and do its own separate jobs because it's separated from the rest. So the word organelle actually means little organ. And so just like in your body, big picture, you have your body, but each organ has a specialized job, right? And it's separate from the other things because it has a special job. And so that's kind of like what the organelles are for the cell. So each tiny organ basically has its own job, its own little kind of separate space so that it could do its job and be separate and then contribute to how the whole thing works and comes together to live. So organelles have different jobs, and we'll talk about that, in the next slide. So eukaryotic cells include a lot of different things. So animal cells, plant cells, even fungi. So like mushrooms, that is a separate group. It's not a plant. And then this other kind of random group called protists. So those guys are single celled, but because they have organelles, they are eukaryotic. So let's go into the different organelles. So like I mentioned, just to cover this, so these are 4 of the things that are in all cells. So the plasma membrane is the cell membrane that covers, the cell and separates the inside of the cell from its environment. The cytoplasm is the jelly-like region that has the other organelles in it. Ribosomes are the 3D printers that make proteins. And then the nucleus is where the DNA is. It's housing the DNA, and that's, pretty important, as we'll get into in a few lectures. So those are some things that are, common to all cells, but obviously in eukaryotic cells also. And then some other organelles include the cytoskeleton. So that is a network of protein fibers that helps maintain the shape of the cell. So even though we don't really show it, we kind of just show, what we can at the time to help demonstrate and teach certain things. But inside the cell, it's not so much like a water balloon that's kind of loose and floppy. There is kind of a little internal skeleton for the cell that's made of these fibers that help maintain the shape of the cell. So it gives it structure, and it also kind of helps in moving some things around the cell. So yeah, even though we don't really show it that much, there is this whole network of fibers throughout the cell that helps maintain the shape, and then also helps move things around. And then the next one is the mitochondria. So I don't know, for some reason, we all know the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's the only thing we ever hear or learn or take away from biology. And that's because it makes energy for the cell. And so next lecture we'll get into like, okay, why is it called that? Like, how does it make the energy for the cell? So that's what the mitochondria does. And then also not typically shown, but on the outside of the cell, there's also some fibers that cover like the surface of the cell. And that's called the extracellular matrix. So that helps one cell kind of attach to other ones to form a tissue and allows cells to communicate with each other. So yeah, even though that's not also typically shown, that is part of a cell. And there's a bunch of other, organelles, obviously, that are important, but I wanted to just focus on the main ones, like what makes something function. So here is a picture, showing the different organelles. Oops. I kind of wanted to do laser pointer. Okay. So it's a nice little summary. It's kind of a lot at once, but if you just focus on one organelle at a time, it has a summary of each one. So the nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle. So there is a membrane that, separates the inside of the nucleus from the rest of the cell. And the DNA is in there. The cytoskeleton is shown a little bit here. So there's a bunch of different microtubules, like fibers that do extend throughout the whole cell. And it's just kind of like summarized here. The plasma membrane or the cell membrane is like the outer surface that lets things in and out. And then there are other things, but like I said, we'll just focus on a couple as it relates to the cell big picture. The cytoplasm that everything else kind of just like kind of floats around in, and then the mitochondria produces energy. And so eukaryotic cells include plant cells and animal cells. And so on the left is a typical, generic animal cell, and then on the right is a generic plant cell. And so there are some things that are kind of like additional in plant cells. So for example, in plant cells, there is a membrane, a cell membrane or plasma membrane, but on the outside of that, there's a cell wall. So that cell wall helps protect the cell, gives it that structure, like kind of pretty square, rectangular shape. It provides the structure and protects the cell. So if you see a picture of a cell and you see cell wall, boom, that's a plant cell. Technically, prokaryotic cells can have cell walls, but they're made of different stuff. So just ignore that. So plant cells have cell walls in addition to their plasma membrane. They have these organelles called chloroplasts, and in here they make energy through photosynthesis in plant cells. So we'll talk more about that next lecture, but that's a specialized cell in plant cells only, and some protists, but obviously not in animal cells, or else we'd be green. So chloroplasts are the site of photosynthesis, and that's how plants make energy. And then they also have this big like sac of water that is called the central vacuole. So it helps regulate the cell's concentration of water. It's filled with like sap, but it also like takes in and out water and helps also provide structure in a way. So yeah, those are some things that are unique just to plant cells. You won't find these three things in an animal cell. And just to go back to the plasma membrane, so again, the plasma membrane is something that's in all cells, whether it's prokaryotic or eukaryotic, plant or animal. The plasma membrane has to be there because that's what makes it a cell, separate from the environment. So a cell's plasma membrane is the cell's boundary. That's what separates the inside from the outside and makes it being a cell possible. Just like we wouldn't, so the cell membrane lets certain things in and certain things out. So there's some stuff that you want to come in, like nutrients and things to build molecules and energy and stuff like that. So you want those things in, but you also want to take waste products out. So through natural processes, like your cells will generate some like waste products that if they build up will be toxic to the cell. So that stuff has to go out. But at the same time, it has to be selective. So the plasma membrane is what we call selectively permeable. So it only lets certain things in and out. And that's because they actually have a lot of different kinds of proteins in the cell membrane. So again, we kind of, in some pictures, we picture, you know, something very simplified. And then there's always more detail. In biology, there's always more detail. So in the plasma membrane, there are different proteins that let things in and out. And then there are some things that are markers on the surface for cells to recognize each other. So for them to be able to tell, like, oh, you are a fellow liver cell. I'm a liver cell. I'm connecting to a fellow liver cell. So we need to work together to, you know, do the things that we need to do or whatever. And to help recognize, like, okay, that is from, you know, our same person, body, versus any like foreign things like allergens and stuff like that. So yeah, these receptors, proteins can also be receptors to help cells communicate with each other. So some of them will receive like a molecule and be like, okay, that means that we have to start dividing. And so they, you know, start a whole process inside the cell. So there's a lot of stuff within the plasma membrane that helps it function. It's not just that one little layer. It's actually made of, you know, a lot of different stuff in there. And that's what helps let things in and out and what helps cells communicate and recognize each other. Yeah. And so something that's interesting in biology is how viruses infect cells. So they, like I said, viruses are just kind of like shells. And then they have proteins sticking out on the outside. And so sometimes viruses can evolve to trick the receptors in our cells into letting the virus into certain cells. So for example, HIV tricks these receptors called CD4 receptors, and they're specifically in only some parts of the cell. So not all your cells have the same receptors, you know, there have to be different ones for the different specialized cells. And so that's why viruses only infect certain kinds of cells. So HIV docks at and binds to receptors in white blood cells, and that's how it kind of like tricks its way into letting in the cells by binding to that receptor in that kind of cell. Another example is the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes the COVID-19 respiratory disease. So the SARS-CoV-2 virus is the actual name for the virus. And it, you know, like I said, it has like a shell. And then it has actually RNA inside instead of DNA. But there are proteins on the outside. And so these proteins bind to and trick some of our cells into letting it in. And again, it's only certain cells that have that kind of receptor. So this is called the ACE2 receptor. And so these receptors will specifically, you know, infect the lungs, heart, blood vessels, kidneys, liver, GI tract. So there's different cell types in these areas that have these receptors. And so that's why when you have certain symptoms, it's because those are the kinds of cells that get infected with this virus. So especially the respiratory system in the lungs. Yeah. So that's all about cells, different parts of the cell, the main parts of the cell, and how they kind of are like little organs and work together to make the whole thing function. And all of it is important. So even though we kind of summarize here, all of it is important and works together to make the whole thing function.